So we're continuing to discuss parallelograms, which we mentioned in the first lesson, or quadrilaterals, I'm sorry. And a type of quadrilateral is a parallelogram. And a parallelogram is a quadrilateral in which opposite sides are parallel. And because besides being parallel, the opposite sides of a parallelogram are also congruent. So looking at this shape, ABCD, which is a parallelogram, I know two things. First of all, I know that my opposite sides are congruent. The second thing I know is that they're parallel. And the symbol you will see for parallel is having an arrow drawn on the sides, or having two arrows drawn. So the pink lines that I've drawn here represent those sides are the same, and the blue arrows represent that they are parallel. So we're supposed to, knowing that they're parallel, solve for x and find the lengths of BC and AD. Well, if I know that BC and AD are the same length, because it's a parallelogram, then what I know is that 16 plus 2x is equal to 10 plus 8x. And I can, solve this for x, which means I want to get my x's on one side and all of my numbers on the other. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this 16. So I have 2x is equal to 10 minus 16 is negative 6 plus 8x. Then I'm going to subtract my 8x from both sides. So I know that negative 6x is equal to negative 6. And the last thing I'm going to do is divide both sides by negative 6. So I know that x equals, well, negative 6 divided by negative 6 is not 0, it is 1. So if x is 1, that's half the battle. Because the first thing it told me to do was solve for x. Then it said, and find the lengths of BC and AD. Well, I know that BC is 16 plus 2x, and I just found out that x is really 1. So that means it's 16 plus 2 times 1. Well, that's just 16 plus 2, and that is 18. So BC is 18, which means that AD is also 18, because they are going to be congruent. It's also important to know that the opposite angles of a parallelogram are also congruent. So if it's a parallelogram, the opposite angles are congruent, which means that if this one's 82, that one's 82. And we use the little semicircle or the arc to represent angles that are the same. So if this bottom one is 98, then the top one is also 98. So if I had to write those in, we'd have 98 on top and 82 in the right. So knowing that ABCD is a parallelogram, solve for x and find measure A, the measure of angle A and the measure of angle C. So we have our parallelogram here. We know that this opposite sides are congruent, so these are both 53. That also tells us that A and C are equal. So we can say that 107 plus 10x is equal to 97 plus 15x. Again, I can solve for x, which means I want x's on one side and my numbers on the other. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract from 107 from both sides. So I get that 10x is equal to negative 10 plus 15x. Then I can subtract 15x from both sides because, again, I need all my x's on the left. So I now know that negative 5x is equal to negative 10. And the last thing I'm going to need to do is divide both sides by negative 5. Negative 10 divided by negative 5 is 2. I still don't have my answer quite yet because the original question asked me what the measure of angle A was. Well, I know A is 107 plus 10x, and x is really 2. So it's 107 plus 10 times 2 is 20. 107 plus 20 is 127. And if A is 127, C is 127 because they are equal. It's also important to note that consecutive angles, consecutive means in a row next to each other, in a parallelogram are supplementary. Probably haven't heard the word supplementary in a while, but supplementary means they add up to 180 degrees. So what that's telling us is that two angles in a row, so for example, A and D, or D and C, or C and B, or B and A, they're always going to add up to 180 degrees. So knowing that, we know that 30 plus 5x plus 15 plus 10x has to equal 180. So again, I can solve for x. I need x's on one side, my numbers on the other. Before I start moving stuff, I want to combine things because I know that I can combine 30 and 15 because they both just have numbers. And I can also combine 5x and 10x because they both have x's. If I do that, I get 45 plus 15x, and that's still equaling 180. And now I can solve. So I want my x's by itself. I need to get rid of my 45. So I'm going to subtract 45 from both sides, and I have 15x equals 135. And then for my final step, I can divide both sides by 15. And I get that x equals 9. So x is 9. Well, it didn't ask me for x ultimately. It asked me to find angle A, and angle D. Well, to find angle A, I need to do 30 plus 5 times x, and x was 9. So that's 30 plus 5 times 9, which is 30 plus 45, which is 75. So angle A equals 75. Now angle C, I can't just put 75 for that one because they're not congruent. They are what we call supplementary, which means they add up to 180. So I actually have to plug in and work that one out. So for angle D, I know that it's 15 plus 10x, and we again know x is 9. So we have 15 plus 10 times 9 is 90, and 15 plus 90 is 105. So this is for angle D. So angle D measures 105 degrees. All right, talking about the diagonals of a parallelogram. So the diagonals are the ones that go all the way across. They're diagonal from each other. It's important to note that they bisect each other. Bisect means split in half. All right, so we know that parallelogram ABCD, and we know that BM, so this part here, from B to M, is 22 minus 3x. And we know that DM is 10 plus 9x. So let's just start there. It also tells us about AM and CM. We'll come back to those. It says solve for x and y and find the lengths of BD and AC. Well, if I know that this diagonal AC splits BD in half, then I know that 22 minus 3x, which is the length of BM, has to be the same as 10 plus 9x, the length of MD. So I can solve, which means I want x's on one side and my numbers on the other. So I'm going to minus 22 from both sides. So I get that negative 3x equals negative 12 plus 9x. And then I want to get rid of my 9x, so I'm going to subtract it from both sides. So negative 12x equals negative 12. And the last thing I'm going to do is divide both sides by negative 12. And when I do that, I get that x equals positive 1. So to find the length of BD, let's just start with finding the length of BM. We know that to find the length of BM, it's equal to 22 minus 3x And we just solved and found out that x was really 1. So it's 22 minus 3 times 1, which is 22 minus 3, and that is 19. So now we know that instead of BM being 22 minus 3x, it's really 19, which means that MD is also 19. So to find the whole thing, we do 19 plus 19, and we get 38. Now, to find AC, you would do the exact same thing, but I'm not going to make you work it out because we're going to do plenty on our checkup as well. And this example is just like the other one, so we are going to move on to the checkup. All right, so quick review. Parallelograms. We know that opposite sides are congruent. We know that opposite angles are congruent. We've also learned that consecutive, which means in a row or next to each other, angles add up to 180. And the last thing that we learned was that diagonals bisect each other. That means they split each other in half. So we've got a couple questions here. Number 1, what is the length of CD? Well, CD we know is the same as AB, so it's going to be 7. Even though it doesn't ask about it, I'm going to ask you for the length of AD. Well, if BC was 9, AD is also 9. Number 3 says, what is X? Well, I know that FG is the same as EH, so I can say that 4X plus 5 is equal to 28. And I can solve, which means I want x's on one side and my numbers on the other. So that means I need to subtract 5 from both sides. So I get that 4x equals 23. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 4. And I get that x equals 5.75. So that would be my answer in this case. Number 5 says if LB is 6, so this little part is 6, and LN is equal to 2x plus 5, what's x? Well, so this whole piece is 2x plus 5. Remember, the diagonals are bisected, so if this LB is 6, that means that BN is also 6, which means this whole piece is really 12. So what we know now is that 2x plus 5 has to equal 12. And we can solve. Which means you want x's on one side, numbers on the other. So I need to subtract 5 from both sides. So 2x equals 7. And then I can divide both sides by 2, and I get that x equals 3.5. Number 7 says, what is the measure of angle E? Angle E is here. Well, you've got to decide, are these angles opposite of each other or are they consecutive? So since they're next to each other, that means they're consecutive. Opposite would mean they would be across from each other, and they're not. So we know that they're not congruent, but instead they're supplementary, which means that 110 plus, we're going to call this one x, has to equal 180. So again, I'm solving for x, which means I want x's on one side and my numbers on the other. So I'm going to subtract 110 from both sides, and I get that x equals 70. So this missing angle here, angle E, must be 70 degrees. I know I'm not supposed to do 6 with you because that's what you're supposed to do on your own, but it does say what is the measure of angle E. Well, angle E is across from C, so these two are going to be congruent. So angle E is going to be 65. Number 9 says, what is X? Well, we know G, or we know something about G, and we know J. We actually know what it is. And they're going to be consecutive angles, so that means that if I add them together, I should get 180 degrees. So I'm going to solve. I want x's on one side and my numbers on the other. So I know I can add 25 and 104 because they're both just numbers. So I'm going to do that first. So 2x plus 129 equals 180. Then I'm going to subtract 129 from both sides. So 2x equals 51. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and I get that x equals 25.5. So that would be x in this case.